I think we've got a problem with neoprene rear crank seals. For a while now, we've been getting engines that are dripping more oil than we would expect. And each time you really rather suspect it's the neoprene seal. Well, this is Amy's car, and I built the engine much less than 1,000 miles ago, and we had oil covering the sump guard and dripping down from it. Taking the gearbox and bell housing off and the flywheel, and indeed we find that it's the rear crank seal that's losing the oil. Let's go and have a look. Now I apologise, I've cleaned all this up before I realised this really warranted a video. But you can see from where out here, significant amounts of oil, and that was basically the whole of the back of the block covered in oil. And there's a big pool here and a big pool here, and we still have a fair amount just there. So I'm absolutely sure this seal has failed. So the question at this point is it the seal that's failed of its own accord, or is it that the spring that retains tension on the lip has popped out? Either way, it's a fairly consistent problem. So I'm going to pop out our rear housing and see what we shall see. See whether, and fundamentally, I'll be looking to see whether the spring has popped out of the neoprene or not. That's my first test. Right, let's get this out. I'm going to loosen and remove the 4 rearmost sump bolts. And all 6 of the housing bolts. Now with our safety blade, we're going to just carefully run along the top of the gasket. Now how easy this is depends on how long the gasket has been there and how much blue Hylamar or whatever has been used. Come on, there it goes. There we are. Is a perfect neoprene. The spring is there. You know, if I can just, there it is. There's the spring, all perfectly intact, exactly as it should be, and yet it's still leaking. So, I think I'm going to have to stop using these, and we'll put in the old felt and see how that behaves. Watch this space. Let's go and find a felt one. Now, you always used to be able to get good quality NAK neoprenes, which were 10mm thick. Now, for the last 6 or 8 years, we've had to tolerate these items, which are only 6mm thick, and that's a big difference. And I think, altogether, given what we've just seen on that car, and that we know on other customers' cars we have the same problem, that these just can't do the job. So we're faced with a choice of trying to get NAK to make us a batch of correct spec neoprenes for the rear crank, or simply going back to the felt. And in this instance, we're going to go for the felt. So here's a used one I've just put through the parts washer. Let's go. There's the securing ring and the circlip. Let's just go and get a felt. So in goes the felt, on goes the ring. Press down the ring, making sure it doesn't drop into the circlip groove. And make sure that that ring has gone securely into its groove, which does need a little bit of encouragement, I think. There we go. Now, what I'm going to do now is just run a bead of oil around it. If we had put the oil on first, I'm pretty sure the felt would expand too much to get that circlip in comfortably. So I'm happy with doing it this way round. Now the reason I pre-oil it is to make absolutely sure that the felt ring doesn't burn in the first few rotations of the crankshaft and therefore become a much shorter lifespan. All right, there we go. Many of you messaged me to say, oh, those correct original style seals are available on the continent. So with our German shipment, we got in some, and you're quite right. Thank you very much for everyone who told me. Shame we can't source them in England anymore, but nonetheless, they're still very good value. So let's just compare it. Right, inside there is the original felt as we fitted last time, but we're not going to use. That is the original spec neoprene seal for the rear crank. And that is the rubbish that UK have been supplying us with. These fail very, very early on. Let's try out again with the original spec. Now, bearing in mind that we were building engines for a good decade using this style of seal without any problem at all. So I do not anticipate this being bad, but let's trial it and see. In Amy's car, it's going to get a bit of a pasting. I know she uses the full 7,000 RPM rev range on that car, so it will be under quite a bit of stress. Let's see how she gets on. So the first thing is we get the modified rear housing, and I shall go over to the press and press that in neatly. Now our modified housings have a shoulder here, so you can press that tidally back to the shoulder, but if you've got one of the replacement new production housings, then it's just a single radius all the way through, so you just have to take the seal so that it's flush with the housing upper surface here. Okay, that's ready to go. Now, you may have spotted in some of my engine building videos that the gasket is slightly too large. There at the bottom we have a couple of tangs that need to be trimmed back. Now, because we're going to use blue Hylamar on this afterwards, any inaccuracy in you trimming back should be covered by the blue Hylamar. So let's just do that. This one's quite a thick gasket. Often they're quite a thin paper one. That's quite fine. I don't think there's any difference in the quality. Obviously it's always slightly more reassuring to have the thicker gasket. So now next let's just put the blue Hylamar on the two gasket surfaces, both the rear gasket and the sump. The sump one of course is particularly important. And we leave that for 10 minutes. Let's just have a quick look at that, shall we? And you can see nicely the drain in the centre rear there, where the gathered oil drops back down into the sump rather than saturating the felt seal. Okay. So fitting the neoprene seal, my first task is to smear a light coating of grease just to help the neoprene on. Around the rear of the crankshaft there. There we go. Okay, and then just using the blue Hylamar as a glue, we'll just place the gasket like so. There we go. And a thin smear of grease just around the neoprene itself. The grease is only there for assembly purposes. And now the tricky bit. So we put it at a slight angle down like that, just so we can get the bottom edge on top of the gasket. And then take it so that the lip is flush on the crankshaft. Now, ideally if you've got long fingernails, this works really well. If you haven't, it's a lot harder. Use your fingernail just to drop the lip over the crankshaft, whilst pressing gently in to keep it there. There we go. If I now press on that side, there it is, it's going in nicely. Bingo. Okay, there we go. That's a neoprene seal on. Let's put the bolts back in. Now I always like to do up the end bolts first, on the assumption that it is happily centered, the seal is happily centered on the crankshaft. And these are 1/4 inch UNC bolts, and therefore 10 Newton meters. And the 5/16 bolts take 21 Newton meters. Okay, so the important points there are that there is out there a 6mm thick neoprene seal that is of absolute no use whatsoever. If you ever find one in your gasket set or your kit, throw it away immediately. Completely useless, won't even last 1,000 miles. Second point is how to replace if you're sticking with the felt seals. And there is part of me that thinks that actually a felt seal is no bad idea. Every time you change the clutch, you just change the felt. And the third thing there is that the proper OE quality neoprene for the rear crank seal is out there. And that's it really. Let's see how that gets on in the next coming year, hopefully as competition opens up after this COVID crisis. We'll see. Thank you.